If you look at a map of East Asia, your eye is immediately drawn to two distinct shapes. First, there is the Korean Peninsula, a landmass that juts out from the Asian continent like a defiant finger pointing towards the sea. It is physically attached, part of the mainland, and cannot escape its powerful neighbors. Then, just a short stretch of water away, you see the Japanese archipelago, a long, elegant chain of islands, completely separate from the continent. These two nations, Korea and Japan, are neighbors, separated by a mere sliver of the ocean, the Korea Strait. Yet their histories, their cultures, and their destinies have been profoundly, and often painfully, different. This divergence is not an accident of history. It is a direct consequence of their geography. One is a land bridge, a corridor for armies and ideas, while the other is an island fortress, able to choose when and how it engages with the world. Their proximity has meant they could never ignore one another. For centuries, culture, technology, and people have flowed between them, sometimes peacefully, other times through brutal conquest. The sea that separates them is narrow enough to cross, but wide enough to create a fundamental difference in strategic thinking. For Korea, history has often been something that happens to it, a result of being caught between larger, more powerful states. Its flatlands became battlegrounds, and its mountains became places of refuge. Its very existence has been a constant negotiation with the giants on its doorstep. Its geography made it a prize to be won, a pathway to be controlled, and a buffer zone to be maintained by others. The story of Korea is one of resilience in the face of relentless external pressure, a story written on its very landscape. In stark contrast, Japan's story has been one of isolation and expansion, a narrative dictated by its island status. Being surrounded by water gave Japan a unique defensive advantage. The sea was its wall, protecting it from the overland invasions that plagued its continental neighbors for millennia. This security allowed it to develop a distinct and powerful culture, borrowing from the mainland when it chose to, and shutting the door when it did not. However, this same geography presented a critical weakness, a severe lack of natural resources. Its mountains are volcanic and its plains are small, meaning it has little coal, iron, or oil. This scarcity would eventually drive Japan to look outwards, not just for trade, but for empire, leading it down a path of aggressive expansion that would change the course of world history. Thus, we have two nations, side by side, whose fates were set in motion by the very ground beneath their feet. Korea, the continental peninsula, was destined to be a crossroads of conflict, its fate intertwined with the powers of the mainland. Japan, the resource-poor archipelago, was destined to be a maritime power, its security and prosperity dependent on its control of the seas. Understanding their divergent paths requires us to look beyond politics and ideology, and start with the most fundamental force of all, geography. The mountains, the seas, the plains, and the resources, or lack thereof, have been the silent puppet masters pulling the strings of history in this volatile corner of the world, and their influence is as strong today as it was 1,000 years ago. Korea's geography is its destiny, and often its curse. The peninsula is tethered to the Asian mainland, sharing a long, porous border with China along the Yalu River, and a much shorter but strategically vital border with Russia in the far northeast. To its east lies the sea, and across that sea, its historical rival and colonizer, Japan. This location has made Korea a geopolitical nexus, a point where the interests of three great powers converge and often clash. It is a land bridge connecting continental Asia to the maritime world of Japan. Throughout history, whichever power controlled Korea had a strategic advantage. For China, a friendly or subservient Korea acted as a crucial buffer state, protecting its industrial heartland in Manchuria. For Russia, it offered the prize of warm water ports, a centuries-old ambition. For Japan it was, as they once called it, a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan, but also a vital foothold for expansion onto the continent. The very terrain of Korea has shaped its history of conflict. The peninsula is dominated by mountains. Roughly 70% of the land is rugged and hilly. The Taebaek mountain range runs down the eastern coast like a great spine, leaving most of the flat, arable land in the west and south. These plains, concentrated around cities like Seoul and Pyongyang, are where the majority of the population has always lived and where food has always been grown. Consequently, these plains have also been the primary invasion routes and battlegrounds for foreign armies. Control the western plains and you control Korea. The mountains, while making nationwide governance and transport difficult, also served as natural fortresses and bases for guerrilla resistance, places where Korean identity could endure even when the lowlands were occupied by foreign forces. This unforgiving geography meant that Korea was almost always in a defensive crouch, forced to contend with neighbors who were bigger, more populous, and often more powerful. China's influence has been the most enduring. For centuries, Korea existed as a tributary state, absorbing Chinese culture, writing, and political philosophy while fiercely guarding its own unique identity. It was a delicate balancing act, paying homage to the giant to the north to maintain a degree of autonomy and peace. This relationship defined its foreign policy for dynasties. The arrival of Western powers and an industrializing Japan in the 19th century shattered this fragile equilibrium. Suddenly, Korea was no longer just a concern for China, but became a prize in a much larger, more dangerous game involving Japan and Russia. The strategic importance of the peninsula made it an inevitable target. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Japan, Russia, and China fought over who would dominate Korea. Japan, with its modernized military and island nation ambitions, ultimately won this contest, defeating both China in 1895 and Russia in 1905. This led to Japan's formal annexation of Korea in 1910, beginning a brutal 35-year colonial rule. The Japanese sought to erase Korean culture and exploit its resources and labor to fuel their own growing empire. For Japan, controlling the peninsula was not just about resources, it was about strategic depth, removing that dagger and turning it into a spear to be thrust into Manchuria and beyond. Korea's geography had once again determined its fate, making it the first stepping stone in Japan's imperial march across Asia. The end of World War II in 1945 did not bring freedom to Korea, but rather a new form of captivity. The defeat of Japan meant its colonial empire was dismantled, but the fate of Korea was decided by others. The victorious Allied powers, namely the United States and the Soviet Union, agreed to temporarily divide the peninsula to oversee the surrender of Japanese troops. The line they drew, the 38th parallel, was a line of convenience on a map, chosen by American officials in Washington who knew little of Korean geography or culture. It sliced through communities and landscapes with no regard for local realities. The Soviets were to occupy the north and the Americans the south. This temporary division soon hardened as the Cold War began to freeze international relations. The two superpowers installed governments that mirrored their own ideologies, a communist regime in the north and a capitalist pro-Western one in the south. This ideological division was exacerbated by the peninsula's geography. The north, under Kim Il-sung, inherited the mountainous, resource-rich industrial heartland that Japan had developed. It had hydroelectric dams, coal mines, and heavy industry. The south, under Syngman Rhee, was left with the majority of the peninsula's agricultural land and a larger population, but less industry. This imbalance created immediate economic friction. In 1950, North Korea, with the backing of the Soviet Union and China, launched a full-scale invasion of the south, seeking to reunify the peninsula by force under communist rule. The Korean War had begun. The initial northern advance was swift, pushing South Korean and American forces back to a small corner of the peninsula known as the Pusan Perimeter. Geography played a key role. The North's tanks rolled easily down the western coastal plains. The war raged for 3 devastating years, drawing in forces from the United States, the United Nations, and China. The conflict was a brutal slog, with battle lines surging up and down the peninsula. The mountainous terrain made advances difficult and costly, favoring defenders and leading to protracted stalemates, particularly during the harsh winters. General MacArthur's daring amphibious landing at Incheon, far behind enemy lines on the western coast, was a brilliant strategic move that leveraged geography to outflank the North Korean army and change the tide of the war. However, when UN forces pushed north towards the Chinese border, China intervened, sending hundreds of thousands of volunteers across the Yalu River to push the UN forces back. China could not tolerate a unified, pro-American Korea on its border. Ultimately, the war ended in 1953, not with a peace treaty, but with an armistice. The final boundary, the demilitarized zone, was established roughly along the 38th parallel, the same arbitrary line that had started the trouble. The division of Korea was now sealed in concrete and barbed wire. Today, North and South Korea remain technically at war. The North is one of the most isolated and militarized states on Earth, its mountainous terrain serving as a natural fortress for its regime and a hiding place for its military assets. The South, with its accessible coastal plains and harbors, has become a global economic powerhouse, embracing trade and technology. The two Koreas are a stark illustration of how the same geographic space can produce radically different societies when bisected by an ideological line. The scar of the 38th parallel runs deeper than the landscape itself. Japan's geography is the key that unlocks its history. It is an archipelago, a nation of over 6,800 islands, though four main ones, Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku, make up the vast majority of its landmass and population. This island status is honestly the single most important factor in its development. Being surrounded by water has been Japan's greatest defense. For most of its history, the sea protected it from the waves of invasion that, periodically washed over mainland Asia. The Mongols, who were the most formidable land power of their day, tried to invade Japan twice in the 13th century and failed both times. Their fleets were famously wrecked by typhoons the Japanese called kamikaze, or divine winds. This sense of security, of being separate and divinely protected, really fostered a unique and fiercely independent culture. It allowed Japan the luxury of choice. It could import ideas from China and Korea when it suited them, then shut its doors for centuries of self-imposed isolation, as it did during the Tokugawa shogunate. However, the land that gave Japan security also presented immense challenges. The Japanese islands sit directly on the Pacific Ring of Fire, one of the most tectonically active zones in the world. This means the country is plagued by a constant threat of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis. This volatile geology has shaped the Japanese character, instilling a deep respect for the power of nature and honestly fostering a collective resilience and preparedness. The landscape itself is rugged and mountainous, with over 80% of the country covered by mountains. This leaves very little flat land for agriculture and settlement, so the population is densely packed into coastal plains, creating some of the most crowded urban areas on the planet. The Kanto Plain, home to Tokyo, is the largest, making it the country's economic and political heart. The most critical consequence of Japan's geology is its profound lack of natural resources. The islands have almost no oil, iron ore, coal, or other minerals essential for an industrial economy. For centuries, when Japan was a feudal, agrarian society, this was not a critical problem. But with the arrival of Western powers in the mid-19th century, armed with industrial technology, Japan faced a stark choice: modernize and industrialize, or risk being colonized like so many other nations in Asia. It chose to modernize with astonishing speed during the Meiji Restoration, but to fuel its new factories and build a modern military, it needed resources it simply did not have. This fundamental geographic scarcity became the primary driver of its foreign policy. This need for resources pushed Japan to look outward. Its first target was nearby Korea, followed by Manchuria in China, which was rich in coal and iron. Japan's geographic position as an island nation made it a natural maritime power. It built a powerful navy to protect shipping lanes and project its power abroad, modeling it on the British Royal Navy, another island nation that built a global empire based on sea power. Japan's expansionist drive in the early 20th century was not born of pure malice, but from a cold, hard geographic reality. To be a great power, it needed resources. To get those resources, it needed an empire. This logic set Japan on a collision course with the United States and the other Allied powers, leading directly to the attack on Pearl Harbor in the Pacific War. The Second World War ended with Japan's total and unconditional surrender. Its empire was dismantled, its military was disbanded, and its cities lay in ruins. The country was occupied by the Allied forces, led by the United States. It really seemed that Japan's bid for greatness, driven by its geographic imperatives, had ended in catastrophic failure. However, geography once again played a pivotal role in its post-war transformation. As the Cold War intensified, the United States' strategic thinking about Japan shifted dramatically. Japan was no longer a vanquished enemy, but a crucial potential ally in the fight against the spread of communism in Asia. Its location, just off the coast of Soviet Russia and China, and near the Korean peninsula, made it an unsinkable aircraft carrier for American military power in the Pacific. This new strategic reality led to the US-Japan Security Treaty, which remains the cornerstone of Japan's defense policy to this day. Under this nuclear umbrella, Japan was freed from the need to spend heavily on its own military. Its new constitution, written under American guidance, renounced war as a sovereign right. This allowed Japan to channel all its energy and resources into economic reconstruction. It pivoted from a military power to an economic one. Its island geography, which had once driven it to secure resources through conquest, now became an asset for trade. With deep water ports and a long coastline, Japan was perfectly positioned to import raw materials from around the world, transform them into high-quality manufactured goods, and export them back out. Its factories became its new armies, and its corporations, its new generals. Japan's post-war economic miracle was a masterclass in overcoming geographic limitations through technology and trade. Lacking its own energy sources, it became a world leader in building nuclear power plants and developing energy-efficient technologies. Lacking vast tracts of land, it pioneered just-in-time manufacturing to minimize the need for large warehouses. It built a world-class high-speed rail network, the Shinkansen, to overcome the challenges of moving people and goods through its mountainous terrain. The same cultural traits forged by its volatile geography, discipline, collective effort, and meticulous planning were now applied to industry and commerce. Japan proved that a nation does not need a large territory or abundant natural resources to become a global economic superpower. However, Japan's geography continues to present enduring vulnerabilities. Its reliance on imported energy and raw materials means its economy is highly susceptible to disruptions in global supply chains and political instability in regions like the Middle East. Its dense coastal population remains at high risk from natural disasters, a fact tragically highlighted by the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, which triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Furthermore, its pacifist stance is being tested by the rise of a more assertive China and the persistent threat from a nuclear-armed North Korea. Japan finds itself in a dangerous neighborhood, forcing it to reconsider its security posture and its alliance with the United States. Its geography still defines its fears and shapes its choices. The modern security landscape of East Asia is dominated by a triangle of tension between North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. Each nation's fears, ambitions, and strategic posture are deeply rooted in its specific geography. North Korea, the so-called Hermit Kingdom, leverages its geography for survival. Its mountainous terrain provides natural defenses in ideal locations to hide its nuclear weapons and missile facilities from satellite surveillance and potential preemptive strikes. Its short border with Russia and long border with China act as economic and diplomatic lifelines, preventing total isolation and collapse. For the Kim regime, its nuclear arsenal is the ultimate guarantor of its security, a deterrent against a superior conventional military force, and a means to prevent a US-led regime change. Its geographic position allows it to hold its neighbors hostage, its artillery can reach Seoul, and its missiles can reach Japan, creating a permanent state of crisis. South Korea lives under a constant shadow, a reality dictated by its proximity to the north. The capital city, Seoul, a sprawling metropolis of over 25 million people, is located only about 50 kilometers from the DMZ. This makes it incredibly vulnerable to a sudden attack from the North's vast array of artillery and short-range rockets. This geographic vulnerability shapes South Korea's entire defense strategy, which is built around its alliance with the United States. The presence of nearly 30,000 American troops on its soil serves as a tripwire, ensuring that any attack on the South is also an attack on the US. South Korea's economic miracle is built on its coastal plains and access to global sea lanes, but this openness also makes it exposed. It must constantly balance its economic relationship with China, its biggest trading partner, against its security alliance with the United States, its ultimate protector. Japan, the island nation, watches the Korean peninsula with deep anxiety. A conflict in Korea would have devastating consequences for Japan. It would likely trigger a massive refugee crisis and could potentially involve direct missile strikes on Japanese territory, where several major US military bases are located. North Korea's missile tests, which often fly over Japan or land in its exclusive economic zone, are a constant reminder of this threat. Japan's geographic separation is no longer the perfect defense it once was in the age of ballistic missiles. This has led to a significant shift in Japan's security thinking, with growing calls to strengthen its own military capabilities and play a more active role in regional security, moving away from its post-war pacifism. Its resource scarcity also means it is deeply invested in the stability of the sea lanes through which its energy supplies must pass, routes that are increasingly contested by China. This tense triangle does not exist in a vacuum. It is overseen by the two great powers of the 21st century, the United States and China. The US plays the role of regional security guarantor, its alliances with South Korea and Japan forming the bedrock of its Pacific strategy. These alliances are designed to maintain stability and contain the ambitions of both North Korea and, increasingly, China. China, on the other hand, sees the US military presence as a form of encirclement. It uses its economic leverage over South Korea and its political influence over North Korea to counter American power. China does not want a collapsed North Korea, which would lead to a refugee crisis on its border and a unified pro-US Korea. Thus, it props up the Pyongyang regime just enough to keep it stable, maintaining the status quo. The geography of the region has created a complex web of dependencies and rivalries, a delicate balance of power that could be shattered at any moment. In the end, the stories of Korea and Japan always return to the map. Despite the rise and fall of empires, the clash of ideologies and the breathtaking pace of technological change, the fundamental geographic realities of the region have not changed. The Korean peninsula is still a land bridge wedged between great powers. The Japanese archipelago is still an island fortress short on resources. These simple, unchangeable facts continue to dictate the choices, fears, and relationships that define East Asia. They are the constants in a world of variables. The political weather may change, but the landscape remains the same, and it is the landscape that ultimately sets the course. The tensions of today are echoes of conflicts shaped by topography centuries ago. For Korea, the dream of reunification remains elusive, blocked by the wall of ideology that was built upon its geographic division. The 38th parallel is the most visible scar, but the peninsula's position as a strategic crossroads is the original wound. Any future for a unified Korea will have to navigate the same treacherous geopolitical waters: how to maintain independence while being squeezed between China, a resurgent Russia, and a wary Japan. The South's economic success is tied to the sea, while the North's survival is tied to the land border with China. A unified Korea would be a formidable nation, but its very existence would disrupt the delicate balance of power, and its neighbors will always have a say in its fate. Its location ensures it will never be left alone. Japan, too, remains a prisoner of its geography. Its economic strength is entirely dependent on the maritime trade routes it does not control. Its security is dependent on an alliance with a distant superpower whose long-term commitment is not guaranteed. The rise of China's navy presents a direct challenge to Japan's maritime security, threatening the very sea lanes that are its economic lifeblood. At the same time, the volatile geology of the Ring of Fire is a constant, existential threat that no amount of economic or military power can eliminate. Japan's future choices, whether to rearm, how to manage its relationship with China, and how to secure its energy needs, are all answers to questions posed by its own map. Therefore, as we look at the future of peace and conflict in East Asia, we must look to geography. The location of military bases, the routes of pipelines and shipping lanes, the disputes over tiny islands in the sea, these are the issues that will drive events. The deep-seated mistrust between Korea and Japan is not just a matter of historical memory, but of a permanent geographic reality of a vulnerable peninsula and an anxious archipelago. The strategic calculations of Washington and Beijing are based on control of this critical piece of global real estate. Technology may shrink distances and weapons may fly over mountains, but they do not erase the fundamental importance of place. Geography is the stage upon which history unfolds, and in East Asia, the stage itself ensures the drama will continue.